My name is Darius Kovalenko. I'm a refinery worker who survived the first 14 days of the zombie outbreak. 2 weeks ago, a solar storm killed our power grid and unleashed something that had been hiding in our water supply. Now the infected hunt in coordinated packs, and I'm trapped at Murphy's gas station with hordes closing in. I thought my biggest problem was equipment failures at the Baytown refinery. I was wrong. The real nightmare started when my 70-year-old neighbor tried to tear my throat out with her bare hands. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. I'm sitting here in what used to be Murphy's gas station on Highway 90, about 30 miles east of Houston, and I can hear them getting closer every night. The scratching sounds, the low growls, the way they test the barricades I've built around this place. My name is Darius Kovalenko, and 2 weeks ago I thought the biggest danger in my life was working the night shift at a petroleum refinery. I was wrong about everything. Let me start from the beginning, because someone needs to remember how this all went down. Someone needs to document what really happened during those first few days when the world as we knew it ended. I've been writing everything down by candlelight, trying to get the details right while they're still fresh in my memory. The details matter, because looking back now, there were signs that we all missed or ignored or just didn't understand at the time. I worked at the Baytown refinery for 12 years. 12 years of managing chemical processes, supervising crews, and dealing with equipment that could kill you if you made one wrong move. I thought I knew what real danger looked like. I thought I understood crisis management. The refinery taught me to stay calm under pressure, to think systematically, to always have backup plans. Those skills kept me alive during the first few days of the outbreak, but they couldn't prepare me for what was coming. The week before everything went to pieces, we'd been having problems at the plant. Nothing major, just the kind of irritating equipment failures that make your job harder but don't shut down operations. Control systems would glitch for a few seconds, then come back online. Pressure readings would fluctuate in ways that didn't make sense. The water pressure throughout the facility kept dropping at random intervals, which was strange because our supply came directly from the municipal system. I remember Jim Hendricks, one of the older operators, complaining about his dog that week. Jim had this old German shepherd named Rex, who'd been with his family for 8 years. Gentle as a lamb, according to Jim. But that week, Rex started acting strange. Wouldn't drink from his water bowl, kept pawing at it and whining. Jim thought maybe the bowl was dirty, so he washed it thoroughly, but Rex still wouldn't touch the water. The dog would only drink from puddles outside or from Jim's garden hose. We all laughed about it during shift change. Dogs can be picky, we said. Maybe Rex didn't like the taste of the tap water. Jim laughed along with us, but I could see he was worried. That dog had been drinking from the same bowl for years without any problems. Now I know Rex was trying to tell us something we were too stupid to understand. Sarah Martinez from the day shift mentioned her neighbor acting strange too. Said the guy had been aggressive lately, snapping at people for no reason. He'd been complaining about headaches and seemed confused about simple things. Sarah thought maybe he was having marriage problems or job stress. She said he'd been drinking more water than usual, constantly carrying around a gallon jug and refilling it throughout the day. At the time, it seemed like he was just trying to stay hydrated during the hot October weather. The emergency broadcast system had been acting up that week too. We'd catch fragments of announcements about water advisories in different parts of the state, but the signal kept cutting in and out. The audio quality was so poor that we couldn't make out the details. We figured it was just routine maintenance notifications or minor contamination issues that would be resolved quickly. Texas water systems had been dealing with various problems all summer, so intermittent advisories weren't unusual. Looking back now, I realize we were hearing the first warnings about what was already spreading through the water supply. But the information was so fragmented and the delivery so poor that nobody took it seriously. We were used to bureaucratic communications that didn't seem urgent or relevant to our daily lives. If someone had clearly explained what was happening, maybe we could have prepared. Maybe we could have warned people to stop drinking tap water. Maybe thousands of lives could have been saved. But that's not how it played out. Instead, we went about our normal routines while something invisible and deadly spread through every glass of water, every cup of coffee, every meal prepared with municipal water. The virus had been building in the system for weeks, maybe months, waiting for the right conditions to activate and transform ordinary people into something else entirely. October 15th started like any other night shift. I arrived at the refinery around 10 o'clock in the evening, grabbed my usual cup of coffee from the break room, and headed to the control room for the shift briefing. The day crew reported the same intermittent issues we'd been dealing with all week. Nothing critical, nothing that required shutting down operations, just ongoing minor problems that kept everyone slightly on edge. Around midnight, the electronic glitches started getting worse. Computer screens would flicker, then stabilize. Control readings would jump to impossible values for a few seconds, then return to normal. At first, we thought it might be related to the power grid problems Texas had been experiencing during the hot summer months. The electrical infrastructure was stressed, and we'd been dealing with occasional brownouts and voltage fluctuations. By 2 o'clock in the morning, the problems were becoming more frequent and more severe. I was discussing the situation with my crew when every screen in the control room went completely black. Not a flicker, not a temporary glitch, but total system failure across all our monitoring equipment. The emergency lighting kicked in immediately, bathing everything in that eerie red glow that makes even familiar spaces look threatening. We'd trained for power outages countless times. The refinery had multiple backup systems specifically designed to handle electrical failures. Within minutes, our emergency generators should have restored power to all critical systems. But 20 minutes passed and nothing came back online. The backup generators were dead too. Even the battery-powered emergency equipment was failing one system at a time. That's when we knew this wasn't a normal power outage. This was something bigger, something we'd never encountered before. The older guys started talking about electromagnetic pulses, solar storms, maybe even some kind of attack. Nobody really knew what was happening, but we all understood that our technological world had just been knocked back to the Stone Age. We spent the next few hours securing the facility using manual procedures that most of us hadn't used since our training days. Shutting down chemical processes without computer control is dangerous work that requires perfect coordination and timing. One mistake can cause explosions, toxic releases, or equipment damage that could take months to repair. But we managed it, working by flashlight and emergency lighting, following protocols that had been written decades earlier by engineers who understood that electronics could fail. When the sun came up on October 16th, we realized the scope of what had happened. No cell phones worked, no radios functioned. Cars built after 2010 wouldn't start. The few vehicles that did run were older models without electronic ignition systems or computer controls. The electromagnetic pulse, whatever had caused it, had fried every piece of modern electronics across a massive area. We were effectively cut off from the outside world. No way to contact our families, no way to get news about what was happening in other cities, no way to coordinate with emergency services or government agencies. We were on our own, making decisions based on incomplete information and hoping we were doing the right thing. I decided to stay at the refinery for the first couple of days. The facility had food supplies, water reserves, and defensible positions. More importantly, I felt responsible for helping secure the equipment and chemicals properly. A refinery that's not properly shut down can become a massive hazard to everyone in the surrounding area. We couldn't just walk away from our responsibilities, even if the world outside was falling apart. During those 2 days, we started hearing rumors from people who walked to the facility from nearby neighborhoods. Stories about people acting strange, becoming violent, attacking family members and neighbors. At first, we thought it was just panic and stress from the blackout. People were scared, resources were limited, and tensions were running high. Violence during disasters isn't unusual, unfortunately. But the stories kept coming, and they were getting worse. A woman who lived 5 miles away walked to the refinery to ask for help. She said her husband had attacked her sometime during the night, trying to bite her neck and arms. She showed us the scratches and bite marks, and they looked infected already. The wounds had dark edges and an unusual smell that I couldn't identify at the time. She said her husband's eyes had changed color, becoming bloodshot and wild. He moved differently too, more aggressive and predatory than she'd ever seen him. When she tried to talk to him, he didn't respond to his name or seemed to recognize her at all. She only escaped because she managed to lock herself in their bedroom until he wandered away sometime before dawn. Other people reported similar encounters. Family members and neighbors who had become violent and unpredictable overnight. The common thread was that these people seemed to have lost their ability to communicate normally. They made growling or snarling sounds instead of speaking. They moved with a strange, predatory grace that didn't look quite human, and they all had the same bloodshot eyes and darkened veins visible under their skin. By the morning of October 18th, I couldn't ignore what was happening anymore. The refinery was as secure as we could make it, and I needed to check on my own situation. My apartment was only 15 miles away, but in a world without working vehicles, that might as well have been on the other side of the country. Fortunately, my 1987 Honda motorcycle was old enough to have a purely mechanical ignition system. It started on the first try. The ride home was like traveling through a post-apocalyptic movie. Streets that should have been busy with morning traffic were completely empty, except for abandoned cars that had died when the electromagnetic pulse hit. Traffic lights hung dark and useless. Store signs were blank. The only sounds were distant, sirens that had been wailing continuously since the blackout began, gradually getting weaker as their backup power systems failed. I started noticing the smell around this time, something sweet and rotten that seemed to hang in the air, especially in residential areas. It reminded me of the smell from chemical spills at the refinery, but organic instead of industrial. Decay, mixed with something else I couldn't identify. The smell got stronger as I got closer to neighborhoods with higher population density. There were other signs that something was seriously wrong beyond just the power outage. Curtains moved in windows when there was no wind. Shadows seemed to shift in ways that didn't match the position of the sun. I caught glimpses of movement in yards and driveways, but when I looked directly, nothing was there. My instincts, trained by years of working in dangerous industrial environments, were screaming that I was being watched. The strangest thing was the silence. Even during a power outage, you'd expect to hear people talking, children playing, dogs barking, normal neighborhood sounds. But these areas were eerily quiet, as if everyone had simply vanished. No voices, no footsteps, no signs of normal human activity. Just that persistent sweet rotten smell and the feeling that hostile eyes were tracking my movement. I was about halfway to my apartment when I decided to take a detour through my old neighborhood to check on some people I'd known for years. Maple Street had always been a quiet, friendly area where people looked out for each other. Kids played. In the yards, neighbors chatted over fences, and everyone knew everyone else's business. It was the kind of place where you'd expect people to band together during a crisis. But as I turned onto Maple Street, I could see immediately that something was wrong. The street looked abandoned, but not in the way you'd expect from an evacuation. Cars were in driveways, front doors were open, and personal belongings were scattered across yards as if people had left in a hurry. But there were no signs of organized evacuation, no notes left for family members, no indication that people had planned to leave. That's when I saw Mrs. Chen. Mrs. Chen was crouched in her front yard, hunched over something that had once been her neighbor's golden retriever. She was a 70-year-old woman who had lived on Maple Street for 30 years, known for her perfectly maintained garden and her habit of bringing homemade cookies to new neighbors. I'd helped her fix her fence 2 summers ago, and she always waved when I drove past her house. But the thing crouched in that yard wasn't Mrs. Chen anymore. Her back was to me as I approached on the motorcycle, and at first I thought she might be trying to help an injured animal. Then she turned her head at the sound of my engine, and I saw what she had become. Her eyes were completely bloodshot, not just red-rimmed from crying or exhaustion, but solid red as if every blood vessel had burst simultaneously. Dark veins spiderwebbed across her face and neck, creating patterns that looked almost like tattoos under her pale skin. Her mouth was covered in blood, fresh and dark, and when she looked at me, she made a sound that I'll never forget. Not quite a growl, not quite a scream, but something between the two that seemed to come from deep in her chest. It was the sound a predator makes when it's been interrupted while feeding. Mrs. Chen rose to her feet with a fluid grace that no 70-year-old woman should possess. She moved like a trained athlete, balanced and purposeful, her head tilted slightly as she assessed me. There was intelligence in those bloody eyes, but it wasn't human intelligence anymore. She was calculating, measuring distance and angles, deciding how best to attack. She came at me faster than should have been possible. One moment she was standing 20 feet away, the next she was sprinting toward my motorcycle with inhuman speed. Her movements were predatory and efficient, covering ground in a way that reminded me of hunting cats I'd seen in nature documentaries. Every step was precise, every motion designed to close the distance between us as quickly as possible. I gunned the motorcycle engine and barely managed to pull away before she reached me. As I accelerated down the street, I looked back and saw her standing in the middle of the road watching me leave with that same calculating stare. She wasn't angry or frustrated that I'd escaped. She was patient, as if she knew there would be other opportunities. That's when I noticed the others. People were emerging from houses along Maple Street, moving toward the sound of my motorcycle engine. They came out of front doors, side yards, and from behind parked cars. All of them had the same bloodshot eyes and dark veins. All of them moved with that same predatory grace. And all of them were focused on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. There were at least a dozen of them by the time I reached the end of the street, and more were appearing from neighboring blocks. They moved with purpose, not shambling or stumbling like you might expect from sick or injured people. These things knew exactly what they were doing, and they were coordinating their movements to try to cut off my escape routes. I realized that whatever had happened to Mrs. Chen had happened to most of the people in this neighborhood. The electromagnetic pulse hadn't just knocked out our technology. It had somehow triggered a transformation in people who had been infected with something that was already in their systems. The timing couldn't be a coincidence. As I raced through the suburban streets on my motorcycle, I started connecting pieces of information that had seemed unrelated just days before. The water pressure problems at the refinery, Jim's dog refusing to drink from his bowl, Sarah's neighbor acting aggressive and drinking excessive amounts of water, the fragmented emergency broadcasts about water advisories, the sweet rotten smell that had been getting stronger in populated areas. Something had been in the water supply, spreading silently through the municipal system while we all went about our normal lives. The electromagnetic pulse had somehow activated it, triggering rapid changes in people who had been consuming contaminated water for weeks or possibly months. The virus, or whatever it was, had been waiting for the right conditions to reveal itself. I found temporary shelter in an abandoned pharmacy about 3 miles from Maple Street. The building was intact and appeared to be empty, though I approached it carefully after what I'd seen at Mrs. Chen's neighborhood. The front door was unlocked, and the interior showed signs of hasty evacuation rather than violence. Cash registers were open and empty, but the medications and supplies were mostly untouched. This gave me my first opportunity to really think about what I'd witnessed and what it meant for my survival. The infected people weren't mindless zombies like you see in movies. They retained enough intelligence to coordinate their movements and plan hunting strategies. They could run at full speed and make tactical decisions about the best ways to pursue prey. But there were patterns to their behavior that I could potentially exploit. They seemed to be attracted to sound and movement, which made sense from a predatory perspective. They appeared to be more active during daylight hours, though I couldn't be certain about their nighttime behavior yet. And most importantly, they still had human bodies with human limitations. They could be injured, they could be outrun by a fast vehicle, and they could be avoided if you understood how they hunted. I spent the rest of that day scavenging supplies and trying to make radio contact with other survivors. The pharmacy had battery-powered emergency radios, and I managed to find one that still functioned despite the electromagnetic pulse. Most radio frequencies were silent, but occasionally I picked up fragments of transmissions from other survivors or emergency services. The news I gathered from these radio contacts was devastating. The blackout covered most of North America, and similar reports of violent attacks were coming from every major population center. Government emergency broadcasts, when they could be received at all, warned people to avoid drinking tap water and to shelter in place until further notice. But those warnings were coming too late for millions of people who had already been consuming contaminated water for weeks. During my second night in the pharmacy, I heard sounds outside that confirmed my worst fears about The infected. They weren't just randomly wandering around looking for prey. They were communicating with each other, making low-pitched calls that carried across significant distances. When one of them made a sound, others would respond from different directions, creating a network of communication that covered several city blocks. I listened to these calls for hours, trying to understand the patterns. The sounds weren't human speech, but they weren't completely random either. There seemed to be different types of calls for different purposes. Short, sharp sounds that might indicate the discovery of prey. Longer, more complex vocalizations that could be coordination signals, and occasional silence that felt more ominous than the calling, as if they were listening for responses or moving stealthily toward a target. This communication ability made them far more dangerous than I'd initially realized. They weren't just individual predators hunting alone. They were pack hunters who could coordinate complex strategies and share information across large areas. If they detected a survivor in one location, they could potentially summon others from miles away to help with the hunt. On my third day at the pharmacy, I had my first extended encounter with one of the infected and learned something that changed my understanding of what we were dealing with. I was searching the storage room for medical supplies when I heard footsteps in the main area of the store. Slow, deliberate footsteps that suggested someone was methodically searching the building. I grabbed a heavy wrench from my toolkit and positioned myself behind a shelf where I could observe without being seen. A man in his 40s entered the storage room, moving with the same predatory grace I'd observed in Mrs. Chen and the others. His eyes had the characteristic bloodshot appearance, and the dark veins were clearly visible on his exposed arms and neck. But this one was different. Instead of immediately rushing toward me when he detected my presence, he paused and tilted, his head as if listening carefully. Then he did something that made my blood run cold. He spoke. Not clearly, and not in complete sentences, but recognizable words mixed with growling sounds. He said what sounded like here and hiding and found. His voice was rough and distorted, but the intelligence behind the words was unmistakable. These things weren't just retaining human physical capabilities. They were keeping parts of human cognitive function as well. The infected man began searching the storage room systematically, checking behind boxes and equipment with the methodical approach of someone who understood that prey might be concealed. He was problem-solving, using reasoning and memory to conduct an effective search. This wasn't instinctive behavior. This was deliberate, intelligent hunting. I managed to escape through a rear exit while he was searching the opposite end of the storage room, but the encounter left me with a profound sense of dread. If the infected retained human intelligence while gaining predatory instincts and enhanced physical abilities, traditional survival strategies might not be effective. You can't hide from something that thinks like a human but hunts like an animal. That same day, I made contact with Frank Morrison, an elderly man who had worked at the municipal water treatment plant for 25 years before retiring. Frank had been hiding in his basement since the blackout began, and his knowledge of the water system provided crucial information about how the infection had spread. According to Frank, the treatment plant had been experiencing unusual problems for months before the blackout. Test results showed intermittent presence of unknown biological agents that didn't respond to standard purification methods. The contamination levels were low enough that they fell within acceptable safety margins, but the organisms were unlike anything in their reference databases. Frank explained that water treatment systems are designed to handle known biological threats like bacteria and viruses that cause traditional waterborne diseases. But if a new type of organism had evolved or been introduced into the system, existing purification methods might not be effective against it. The contaminated water would pass through all the safety checks and be distributed to millions of consumers. The electromagnetic pulse had somehow triggered the activation of whatever was in the water supply. Frank theorized that the organism might have been dormant or slow-acting until exposed to specific electromagnetic conditions. When the solar storm hit and every electronic device failed, it created the perfect environment for rapid biological transformation in people who had been consuming the contaminated water. This explained why the infection appeared simultaneously across such a wide geographic area. It wasn't spreading person to person like a traditional disease outbreak. Everyone, who had been drinking municipal water for the past several weeks, was already infected. The electromagnetic pulse simply activated something that was already in their systems. Frank also provided disturbing information about the scope of the contamination. The affected water treatment plants served most major cities and suburban areas across multiple states. Rural areas with private wells might be less affected, but the vast majority of the population had been exposed. We were looking at a transformation event that could affect millions of people simultaneously. During my 4th day, I witnessed something that demonstrated just how much intelligence the infected retained. I was observing a group of them from a safe distance, trying to understand their behavior patterns, when they encountered a locked door that blocked their path to what they apparently perceived as prey. Instead of simply clawing at the door trying to break it down through brute force, they worked together to solve the problem. One of them found a heavy object to use as a battering ram, while others positioned themselves to catch whatever was inside when the door gave way. They coordinated their timing and applied force strategically to the weakest point of the door frame. When the door finally opened, they rushed inside in a coordinated pattern that prevented their prey from escaping through the same entrance. This wasn't luck or coincidence. This was tactical planning and execution that required communication, cooperation, and reasoning ability. I also observed them using simple tools in ways that suggested they remembered human knowledge about leverage and mechanical advantage. They could operate door handles, climb over obstacles efficiently, and navigate complex environments without getting confused or lost. Whatever the transformation process was doing to their brains, it wasn't simply destroying human cognitive abilities, it was modifying them in ways that made them more effective predators. By the end of my 4th day, I realized that staying in one location was becoming increasingly dangerous. The infected seemed to be expanding their search patterns and becoming more systematic about clearing buildings and areas where survivors might be hiding. They were learning from each encounter, improving their hunting strategies based on experience. I also started picking up radio transmissions that suggested some infected were somehow interfering with survivor communications. Broadcasts would suddenly cut off mid-sentence, or you'd hear strange vocalizations mixed in with human voices. It was as if they were learning to use our own communication methods against us. Frank Morrison's situation deteriorated rapidly on my 5th day. When I checked on him via radio that morning, he sounded confused and complained of severe headaches. His speech was becoming slurred, and he mentioned that he was experiencing unusual thirst despite having plenty of water available. By afternoon, Frank stopped responding to radio calls entirely. When I tried to reach him that evening, someone else answered his radio. The voice was rough and distorted, but I recognized certain speech patterns that suggested it had once been Frank. He was calling for help, asking for someone to come to his location, but something about the way he spoke made it clear that this was no longer the man I'd been talking to just hours before. This was my first direct evidence that the transformation process was ongoing. People weren't just becoming infected immediately after the electromagnetic pulse. Some were changing gradually over a period of days, retaining enough human characteristics to potentially lure other survivors into traps. I realized that I couldn't trust anyone who claimed to be an uninfected survivor unless I could verify their condition through direct observation over an extended period. The infected were becoming sophisticated enough to use deception as a hunting strategy. They understood that other humans would be more likely to approach someone who appeared to need help or claimed to have information about safe areas. This psychological warfare aspect of the infection made every human contact potentially deadly. The natural human instinct to help others in distress was being turned into a vulnerability that the infected could exploit. They were learning to use our own compassion and social cooperation against us. On my 6th day, I received a radio transmission that changed everything. It was a weak signal from what sounded like a group of organized survivors who had established a safe zone at the local high school. They claimed to have secured the building, established reliable food and water supplies, and were actively rescuing other survivors from the surrounding area. The transmission included specific details about their security measures, the number of people in their group, and their plans for long-term survival. It sounded exactly like what every isolated survivor would want to hear. A place of safety, other people to work with, and hope for rebuilding some kind of normal life. But something about the transmission bothered me. The voice was clear and confident, but there were occasional background sounds that didn't quite fit. Brief pauses where you might expect to hear other people talking or moving around. But instead, there was an odd silence. And once or twice, I thought I heard that same low-pitched calling sound that I'd been hearing from the infected at night. I decided to investigate the high school, but carefully and from a distance. If it really was a survivor stronghold, I needed to make contact and share information about what I'd learned. If it was some kind of trap, I needed to know so I could warn other survivors who might be heading toward the location. The approach to the school confirmed my suspicions that something was wrong. The building showed signs of recent activity, but not the kind you'd expect from a group of organized survivors. There were no visible security measures, no guards, no evidence of the systematic approach that people with military or emergency response experience would implement. Instead, I observed several figures moving around the building with that characteristic predatory grace. They were positioning themselves at various entrances and vantage points, clearly preparing for something. This wasn't a rescue operation. This was an ambush designed to capture survivors who responded to the radio transmission. As I watched the high school from my concealed position, I realized I was witnessing the infected's first attempt at sophisticated psychological warfare. They had learned to mimic human rescue operations, using our own survival instincts and desperate hope against us. The radio transmission hadn't been a mistake or coincidence. It was bait, carefully designed to draw survivors out of hiding and into a coordinated trap. I counted at least 8 infected positioned around the school building, each one stationed at strategic points that would allow them to intercept anyone approaching from different directions. They moved with purpose and discipline, checking their positions and maintaining visual contact with each other. This wasn't random behavior. This was military-style tactical positioning executed by creatures that retained enough human knowledge to understand strategy and coordination. The most disturbing part was how they waited. Instead of restlessly prowling or making the calling sounds I'd heard on previous nights, they remained perfectly still for hours. They had learned patience, the ability to delay gratification in favor of a larger reward. These weren't mindless predators driven only by immediate hunger. They were intelligent hunters capable of complex planning and execution. I spent the entire day observing their operation from multiple vantage points, and what I discovered changed my understanding of what we were dealing with. Around midday, I saw 3 separate groups of survivors approach the school in response to the radio transmission. Each group was intercepted before they could reach the building, but not in the violent, chaotic way I expected. Instead, the infected used sophisticated deception techniques. They would allow one member of their group to approach the survivors, while the others remained hidden. That individual would appear helpful and human, offering to guide the newcomers to the supposed safe zone inside the building. The survivors, desperate for human contact and safety, would follow willingly into the trap. Once inside the building, the survivors disappeared. I never saw them come back out, and the infected returned to their positions to wait for the next group. This was systematic harvesting of human survivors using intelligence, deception, and organizational skills that should have been beyond the capabilities of infected individuals. What made this even more terrifying was the implication that the infected were learning and adapting their strategies based on success and failure. The radio transmission was being broadcast repeatedly with slight modifications, testing different approaches to see which ones attracted more survivors. They were conducting psychological experiments on us, refining their techniques through trial and error. I also realized that they were somehow sharing information across different groups. The tactical knowledge demonstrated at the school was too sophisticated to have developed independently. There had to be some form of communication network that allowed infected groups to coordinate activities and share successful hunting strategies across wide geographic areas. During my observation, I noticed something else that would become crucial to my later survival. The infected had weaknesses that could be exploited if you understood their behavioral patterns. They were highly focused on sound and movement, but they seemed to have difficulty with stationary targets that didn't produce noise. When I remained completely motionless for extended periods, they would lose interest and focus their attention elsewhere. They also appeared to have trouble with elevated positions. They could climb stairs and navigate buildings, but they seemed to prefer ground-level hunting. Rooftops and upper floors might offer temporary safety if you could reach them without being detected. This information would prove invaluable in the days ahead. I left the high school area as darkness fell, but not before I witnessed the infected's nighttime behavior patterns. As the sun went down, they became more active and began their systematic calling routine. But now I understood that these weren't random vocalizations. They were status reports, position updates, and coordination signals for a distributed hunting network. The infected at the school were communicating with others across the surrounding area, probably reporting on the success of their trap and sharing information about survivor movements and behavior. Every human they captured wasn't just a victim. It was a source of intelligence that made them more effective at hunting the rest of us. I found temporary shelter that night in an abandoned apartment building about 2 miles from the school. The building was partially collapsed from what appeared to be an explosion or fire, but the upper floors were still structurally sound. I climbed to the 4th floor using a damaged staircase and barricaded myself in an apartment that had a clear view of the surrounding area. This elevated position gave me my first opportunity to observe the infected's wide area coordination patterns. Throughout the night, I could see groups of them moving through the streets below, but their movements weren't random. They were conducting systematic searches of buildings and areas, working in coordinated patterns that ensured complete coverage of their territory. Each group consisted of 3 to 6 individuals who maintained visual or vocal contact with each other while searching. When one group completed their assigned area, they would signal to adjacent groups before moving to their next target zone. The entire operation was executed with the precision of a military search and rescue operation, except the goal was hunting rather than rescue. I also observed something that made me realize just how much danger I was in. Several times during the night, infected individuals would stop in the middle of their search patterns and stand perfectly still, tilting their heads as if listening for something. These listening periods lasted several minutes, and afterwards they would often change direction or modify their search patterns based on whatever they had detected. They were using enhanced sensory capabilities to track survivors across significant distances. Sounds that would be inaudible to normal human hearing were apparently clear signals to the infected. This meant that traditional hiding techniques might not be effective. They could potentially detect heartbeats, breathing, or other biological sounds that survivors couldn't control or eliminate. My 7th day began with a radio contact that provided both hope and additional terrifying information. I made contact with a woman named Lieutenant Sarah Chen, who identified herself as a National Guard communications specialist operating from a military installation about 50 miles north of my position. Lieutenant Chen confirmed that the infection was nationwide and possibly global in scope. Military installations with independent power and water supplies had been less affected, but they were dealing with infected personnel who had consumed contaminated municipal water before the electromagnetic pulse occurred. Even secure military bases weren't safe if their personnel had been exposed during off-duty hours. She provided crucial intelligence about the infected's capabilities and limitations. Military observations confirmed that they retained significant human cognitive abilities while gaining enhanced physical capabilities. They could use tools, operate simple machinery, and execute complex group tactics. However, they appeared to have lost most emotional and social human characteristics, becoming focused entirely on hunting and consuming living humans. Lieutenant Chen also confirmed my observations about their communication abilities. Military signal intelligence had detected organized radio transmissions between infected groups using equipment they had captured from survivors or emergency services. They were learning to use human technology against us, turning our own communication networks into hunting tools. The most disturbing information she shared was about their rapid adaptation and learning capabilities. Military encounters with infected groups showed that they quickly developed countermeasures for tactics that had been successful against them previously. Standard military engagement strategies were becoming less effective as the infected learned to anticipate and respond to conventional approaches. During this radio contact, Lieutenant Chen mentioned something that would become critically important later. She said that some infected individuals seemed to be functioning as coordinators or leaders for larger groups. These individuals who They were calling alphas, demonstrated even higher levels of intelligence and strategic thinking than typical infected. They appeared to be directing the activities of other infected and making complex tactical decisions. I asked Lieutenant Chen about potential solutions or treatments for the infection, but her response was not encouraging. Military medical teams had been unable to develop effective treatments or vaccines. The transformation appeared to be irreversible once it progressed beyond the early stages. Their current strategy focused on containment and survival rather than cure or recovery. Before our communication ended, Lieutenant Chen provided coordinates for potential supply drops and safe zones that military units were attempting to establish. However, she warned that many of these locations had been compromised by infected groups who had learned to monitor military communications and predict supply operations. That afternoon, I decided to investigate one of the locations Lieutenant Chen had mentioned, an abandoned chemical plant about 10 miles from my current position. Military intelligence suggested it might contain supplies and equipment that could be useful for survivor groups, but they hadn't been able to secure the facility due to resource limitations. The chemical plant represented both an opportunity and a significant risk. Industrial facilities often contained materials that could be used for defensive purposes if you understood chemistry and engineering principles. My refinery experience gave me knowledge about handling dangerous chemicals safely, which could be valuable in a survival situation. However, chemical plants were also extremely hazardous environments even under normal circumstances. Without proper safety equipment and procedures, exploring such a facility could be fatal through chemical exposure, explosion, or structural collapse. The risks were magnified by the possibility that infected groups might be using the facility as a base or hunting ground. I approached the chemical plant using the same careful observation techniques I'd developed at the high school. The facility covered several acres and consisted of multiple buildings connected by an extensive network of pipes and processing equipment. Many of the structures appeared to be intact, but there were signs of damage from fires or explosions that had occurred after the electromagnetic pulse. The most important discovery was evidence of recent infected activity throughout the facility. I observed multiple individuals moving through the complex with the systematic approach I'd seen at other locations. They were exploring buildings, testing equipment, and apparently learning how to navigate the industrial environment. This was the first time I'd seen infected individuals in a complex technical environment, and their behavior was revealing. They weren't just wandering through the facility randomly. They were investigating equipment and systems with what appeared to be curiosity and problem-solving intent. Some of them were manipulating valves, switches, and control panels, as if trying to understand how the systems functioned. The implications of this behavior were terrifying. If the infected were learning to operate industrial equipment, they could potentially access resources and capabilities that would make them far more dangerous than simple predators. Chemical plants contained materials that could be used to create weapons, explosives, or toxic substances. In the wrong hands, such facilities could become sources of mass destruction. I spent several hours mapping the facility and identifying potential supply locations before attempting to enter any buildings. The infected seemed to be most active in the central processing areas, so I focused on peripheral structures that might contain useful materials without requiring me to navigate through areas under their direct control. My target was a maintenance building that appeared to contain tools, safety equipment, and possibly communication gear. The building was isolated from the main complex and showed no signs of recent infected activity. However, reaching it required crossing several hundred yards of open ground where I would be visible to anyone conducting surveillance. I waited until late afternoon when the infected typically became less active, then made my approach using available cover and concealment. The maintenance building was unlocked and the interior contained exactly the kind of supplies I needed: industrial tools, protective equipment, portable generators, and most importantly, a functioning radio system with long-range communication capabilities. While I was gathering supplies, I heard sounds from the main complex that made me realize just how much danger I was in. The infected weren't just exploring the facility randomly. They were conducting organized activities that required coordination and planning. I could hear what sounded like construction or modification work, metal being moved and assembled in systematic patterns. They were building something, using the industrial equipment and materials available at the chemical plant. This represented a level of organization and forward planning that went far beyond simple predatory behavior. They were creating infrastructure or tools for purposes I couldn't immediately understand, but that obviously served their long-term objectives. I decided to risk a closer investigation of their construction activities, but what I discovered changed my understanding of the infected's capabilities completely. They had organized an assembly line operation using conveyor equipment from the chemical plant. Multiple infected individuals were working together to modify and combine materials in ways that suggested they understood manufacturing processes. The most disturbing aspect was that they appeared to be creating weapons or tools specifically designed for hunting humans. Sharp implements, projectile devices, and restraining mechanisms that were clearly intended for capturing and controlling prey. They weren't just using their enhanced physical abilities for hunting. They were developing technology to make their hunting more efficient and effective. I also observed what appeared to be a leadership structure within their group. Certain individuals were directing the activities of others, making decisions about work assignments and resource allocation. These leader types moved differently than the typical infected, with more controlled and deliberate behavior that suggested higher cognitive function. One of these leaders noticed me despite my attempts at concealment. Instead of immediately alerting the other infected or attacking, it observed me for several minutes while apparently assessing the situation. Then it made a series of subtle gestures to other infected in the area, positioning them to cut off my potential escape routes. This was my first direct encounter with what Lieutenant Chen had called an alpha infected. The level of tactical thinking and situational awareness it demonstrated was comparable to trained military personnel. It understood concepts like fields of fire, escape routes, and coordinated positioning that required sophisticated military or law enforcement knowledge. I managed to escape from the chemical plant, but only because I used my industrial safety training to create a diversion involving chemical smoke and confusion. The infected's response to my escape attempt showed that they had learned from the encounter and would be better prepared for similar situations in the future. During my escape, I realized that the infected were following me using tracking techniques that went beyond simple pursuit. They were predicting my likely routes and positioning individuals to intercept me at strategic locations. This required understanding of human psychology and behavior that allowed them to anticipate my decision-making process. I was being hunted by something that combined enhanced physical capabilities with retained human intelligence and growing tactical knowledge. Traditional survival strategies weren't going to be sufficient against such sophisticated opposition. I needed to develop new approaches that took into account their learning abilities and organizational structure. That night, while hiding in another abandoned building, I made a disturbing discovery about the scope of their coordination network. I was monitoring radio frequencies when I detected what appeared to be coded transmissions between different infected groups across a wide geographic area. They weren't just communicating locally. They were part of a regional or possibly national network that was sharing information and coordinating activities. The transmissions included location coordinates, resource inventories, and what sounded like tactical reports about survivor activities and military operations. They were conducting intelligence gathering and analysis on a scale that suggested significant organizational capabilities. We weren't just dealing with local groups of infected predators. We were facing a distributed network of intelligent opponents who were actively working to eliminate human survivors. The radio transmissions I intercepted that night revealed something that changed everything I thought I knew about this outbreak. The infected weren't just randomly communicating. They were operating a sophisticated intelligence network that covered hundreds of miles and included detailed information about survivor movements, military operations, and resource locations. They knew where we were, hiding before we even got there. I spent hours listening to their coded transmissions, and gradually I began to understand the structure of what they had built. Different groups were assigned specific territories and objectives. Some focused on hunting individual survivors, others targeted military installations, and still others worked on what they called infrastructure projects. The chemical plant construction I'd witnessed wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a coordinated effort to establish manufacturing and processing capabilities across multiple locations. The most chilling discovery was that they were tracking individual survivors by name and description. I heard my own physical characteristics and last known location discussed in one of their transmissions. They had identified me as a high-value target because of my technical knowledge and the equipment I'd acquired from the chemical plant. There was no place I could hide where they wouldn't eventually find me. But their intelligence network also revealed a critical weakness. The infected were so focused on coordination and systematic approaches that they had become predictable in some ways. Their communication schedules followed regular patterns. Their search operations used standard procedures, and their tactical responses followed logical progressions that someone with military or industrial experience could anticipate. During my 8th day, I decided to use this predictability against them. Instead of continuing to run and hide, I would start actively disrupting their operations using the industrial chemicals and equipment I'd acquired. My refinery background gave me knowledge about chemical processes that could create diversions, disable equipment, or force them to respond to situations they hadn't prepared for. My first target was a communication relay they had established on a radio tower about 5 miles from my location. The infected were using this facility to coordinate activities across a wide area, and disrupting it would force them to modify their operations in ways that might create opportunities for other survivors. The approach to the radio tower required crossing territory that I knew was under active patrol by infected groups. However, I had learned enough about their movement patterns to identify gaps in their coverage during shift changes and weather conditions. Heavy rain seemed to reduce their sensory capabilities, possibly because it interfered with their enhanced hearing. The radio tower facility was more sophisticated than I expected. The infected had installed additional equipment and created what appeared to be a command center with maps, charts, and communication equipment arranged in an organized operational layout. This wasn't improvised survival technology. This was professional-level communications infrastructure, established by individuals who understood radio systems and tactical communications. I planted chemical charges designed to disable their equipment, without causing explosions that might kill any human prisoners they might be holding. The chemical reactions would create corrosive compounds that would destroy electronic components while producing smoke and confusion that would mask my escape route. While I was setting up the charges, I overheard radio communications that provided crucial intelligence about their immediate plans. They were preparing for what they called a convergence operation, where multiple infected groups would coordinate simultaneous attacks on the largest survivor communities in the region. The timing was planned for 3 days from that date, during the new moon when darkness would provide maximum tactical advantage. The targets included the National Guard installation where Lieutenant Chen was operating, several civilian survivor groups I'd been in contact with, and a medical facility where doctors were attempting to develop treatments for the infection. This was a coordinated effort to eliminate organized human resistance across the entire region. I realized that my individual survival was no longer the most important issue. If the infected succeeded in their convergence operation, they would eliminate most of the remaining human resistance in this part of the country. I had to warn the other survivors and help coordinate defensive measures, even though it would expose me to increased danger. After successfully disabling the radio facility, I established contact with Lieutenant Chen and shared the intelligence I'd gathered about the planned convergence operation. Her response confirmed that military intelligence had detected increased infected activity, but hadn't understood the scope of the coordinated threat they were facing. Lieutenant Chen arranged for me to make contact with other survivor group leaders using secure military communication channels. Over the next day, I briefed them on infected capabilities, organizational structure, and tactical approaches based on my direct observations. Many of the survivor groups had been operating under assumptions about infected behavior that were dangerously outdated. The coordination meeting revealed that human survivors had been making critical mistakes in their defensive strategies. Most groups were still thinking of the infected as individual predators or small packs, not as organized military-style units with intelligence capabilities and sophisticated weapons. They were preparing for the wrong kind of fight. I shared my observations about alpha-infected individuals who functioned as tactical leaders and coordinators. Several other survivors reported similar encounters with infected, who demonstrated unusual intelligence and strategic thinking. We were dealing with a hierarchical organization, where the most capable individuals were directing the activities of larger groups. During these coordination discussions, I learned about infected capabilities that I hadn't observed directly. Some survivor groups reported that infected individuals were using psychological warfare techniques, including torture and intimidation of captured humans, to gather intelligence about other survivor locations. They were conducting interrogations and using the information to plan more effective attacks. Other groups had encountered infected who were using human prisoners as bait to lure rescue attempts into ambushes. The infected understood human emotional responses and social bonds well enough to manipulate them for tactical advantage. They were exploiting our compassion and loyalty to each other as weapons against us. The most disturbing report came from a medical team that had captured and examined infected individuals. The transformation process wasn't just changing their behavior and physical capabilities. It was fundamentally rewiring their neurological systems to optimize them for predatory activities while retaining the cognitive abilities needed for complex planning and coordination. According to the medical analysis, the infected retained most of their original memories and knowledge, but their emotional and social responses had been completely altered. They understood human psychology and behavior from an analytical perspective, but they no longer felt empathy, fear, or other emotions that would limit their effectiveness as predators. This explained why they were so effective at psychological manipulation and tactical planning. They had all the knowledge and intelligence of their human selves, but none of the emotional limitations that would prevent them from using that knowledge for hunting and killing other humans. We were being hunted by our own people, transformed into perfect predators who knew exactly how we thought and what we would do. During my 9th day, I had my first direct encounter with what was definitely an alpha infected. I was conducting reconnaissance on one of the facilities targeted for the convergence operation when I was detected and surrounded by a coordinated group of 6 infected individuals. Instead of immediately attacking, they held me at a distance while one of them approached for what appeared to be an interrogation. The alpha was a woman in her 30s who had obviously been in excellent physical condition before her transformation. She moved with the controlled grace of someone with martial arts or military training, and her eyes had the characteristic bloodshot appearance, but with a level of focused intelligence that was immediately recognizable as far above typical infected individuals. She spoke clearly and coherently, asking specific questions about my technical background, the equipment I was carrying, and my knowledge of other survivor group locations and capabilities. Her voice had the rough, distorted quality I'd heard from other infected, but her communication skills were essentially normal human conversation. What made the encounter truly terrifying was that she was conducting a professional interrogation, using techniques that suggested law enforcement or military intelligence training. She knew how to ask questions that would reveal information even if I tried to lie or mislead her. She understood human psychology well enough to identify stress responses and deception indicators. The alpha explained that they had been tracking my activities since the chemical plant incident and had identified me as someone with valuable technical knowledge that could be useful to their organization. She offered me a choice: cooperate with them voluntarily and retain some degree of autonomy, or be transformed through forced infection and lose all personal control while they extracted the information they needed. This was the first time I'd encountered an infected individual who was attempting negotiation rather than immediate predation. She understood concepts like bargaining, mutual benefit, and strategic cooperation. The transformation hadn't eliminated her ability to think in terms of complex social and political relationships. During our conversation, she revealed information about their organizational structure that confirmed my worst fears about the scope of what we were facing. The infected had established a hierarchical command structure with territorial divisions, specialized functional groups, and long-term strategic planning capabilities. They weren't just trying to hunt individual survivors. They were building a new social order designed to systematically eliminate human resistance and establish their own civilization. She described manufacturing facilities where they were producing weapons and equipment specifically designed for hunting humans. medical facilities where they were conducting research on the infection process and human physiology, communication networks that connected infected groups across the entire continent. They were creating a complete alternative society focused entirely on predation and expansion. The Alpha also explained that they were actively recruiting humans, with useful skills and knowledge offering transformation as an alternative to death. Scientists, engineers, military personnel, and other specialists were being given the choice to join their organization voluntarily or be eliminated as threats. This explained why some of the infected facilities I'd observed showed such sophisticated, technical capabilities. I managed to escape from this encounter only by using explosive charges I'd prepared from chemicals acquired at the industrial plant. The Alpha's reaction to my escape was particularly disturbing because she didn't seem angry or frustrated. Instead, she appeared to be analyzing my tactics and equipment for future reference. She was learning from the encounter and would be better prepared for similar situations. The escape confirmed that the infected were tracking me using methods that went beyond normal human capabilities. They had detected my presence at the reconnaissance site despite careful concealment, and they had positioned their ambush team with perfect knowledge of my likely approach routes. They were using intelligence gathering and analysis techniques that suggested access to resources and information sources I didn't understand. That night, I made radio contact with my sister Elena for the first time since the outbreak began. She was operating with a medical team at a hospital complex in Atlanta that had been converted into a fortified survivor community. Her voice was the first familiar human contact I'd had in over a week, and the emotional impact was almost overwhelming. Elena confirmed that the infection had reached Atlanta within days of the electromagnetic pulse, but the medical community there had been somewhat better prepared because they had advance warning from reports in other cities. They had established quarantine procedures and water purification systems that had prevented some of the initial wave of transformations. However, the infected groups in the Atlanta area were demonstrating the same organizational capabilities and tactical sophistication I'd observed. They had established siege operations around major survivor communities, cutting off supply lines and conducting systematic psychological warfare designed to break down resistance morale. Elena's medical team had made some progress in understanding the biological mechanisms of the transformation process, but they hadn't been able to develop effective treatments or vaccines. The infection appeared to involve fundamental changes to neurological and physiological systems that couldn't be reversed using conventional medical approaches. She warned me that the infected were specifically targeting medical facilities and personnel as high-priority threats. They understood that medical research represented the greatest long-term danger to their expansion, so they were making coordinated efforts to eliminate doctors, researchers, and medical equipment before effective treatments could be developed. During our conversation, Elena mentioned something that would become crucial to later events. Her medical team had discovered that some infected individuals retained enough human characteristics to potentially provide intelligence about infected operations and capabilities. However, attempting to capture and study infected subjects was extremely dangerous because of their enhanced physical abilities and tactical intelligence. The conversation ended abruptly when Elena's facility came under attack by a coordinated infected assault team. The last thing I heard was the sound of organized defensive fire and Elena shouting tactical instructions to other survivors. Then the radio went silent, and I had no way of knowing whether she had survived or been captured. This personal loss motivated me to take greater risks in my efforts to disrupt infected operations. I couldn't focus on individual survival anymore when people I cared about were being systematically hunted and eliminated. I decided to conduct direct sabotage operations against infected infrastructure, even though it would certainly expose me to increased danger. My target was a facility that appeared to be serving as a regional command center for infected operations. Radio intelligence indicated that it was coordinating activities across multiple states and was crucial to the success of their convergence operation. Disrupting this facility might delay or prevent the coordinated attacks on survivor communities. The command center was located in a former corporate office building that the infected had extensively modified for their purposes. They had installed additional communication equipment established defensive positions, and converted several floors into what appeared to be operational planning areas with maps, charts, and coordination equipment. The approach to the building required infiltrating an area under heavy infected patrol coverage. However, I had learned enough about their operational patterns to identify vulnerabilities during shift changes and communication schedules. The key was timing the infiltration to coincide with periods when their attention was focused on other activities. Inside the building, I discovered the full scope of their organizational capabilities. They had established what amounted to a military command structure with different departments responsible for intelligence gathering, tactical operations, resource management, and strategic planning. The level of sophistication was comparable to professional military or corporate management systems. I also found evidence of their research and development activities. They were conducting systematic studies of human behavior, survivor tactics, and defensive strategies. They had detailed files on individual survivors, including psychological profiles and tactical assessments that would allow them to predict and counter our responses to their operations. The intelligence files included information about me that was far more detailed than should have been possible, given the limited time they'd had to observe my activities. They knew about my refinery background, my technical specialties, my relationship with Elena, and even personal psychological characteristics that would affect my decision-making under stress. This suggested that they had access to information, sources beyond direct observation. Possibly they had infiltrated survivor communication networks, captured and interrogated more survivors than I realized, or had some other intelligence-gathering capability that allowed them to compile comprehensive dossiers on individual targets. While I was gathering intelligence from their files, I heard radio communications that indicated they were preparing to implement the convergence operation ahead of schedule. Something had triggered them to accelerate their timeline, possibly my own sabotage activities or successful coordination efforts among survivor groups. The new timeline gave survivor communities less than 24 hours to prepare for coordinated attacks that would involve hundreds of infected individuals equipped with specialized weapons and tactical equipment. Most of the targeted communities were not prepared for this level of organized assault and would likely be overwhelmed unless they received immediate warning and assistance. I had to make a choice between continuing my intelligence-gathering mission and immediately transmitting warnings to the targeted communities. The information I was collecting could be valuable for long-term resistance efforts, but the immediate threat required urgent action to save lives. I chose to abandon the intelligence mission and focus on transmitting warnings, but as I prepared to leave the command center, I realized that I was trapped. The infected had detected my presence and surrounded the building with a coordinated response team that included several alpha individuals and specialized equipment designed for capturing human intruders. The infected response team surrounding the command center building wasn't like the coordinated groups I'd encountered before. These were specialists, equipped with what appeared to be military-grade tactical gear and weapons that had been modified for specific purposes. Through the windows I could see them establishing professional siege positions with overlapping fields of fire and coordinated communication protocols. What made the situation even more desperate was that they weren't trying to storm the building immediately. Instead, they were implementing a patient containment strategy designed to prevent my escape while they prepared for a careful extraction operation. They understood that I had valuable information and technical skills that would be more useful if I was captured alive rather than killed in a hasty assault. I had perhaps an hour before they would be ready to begin their extraction operation, and I needed to use that time to transmit warnings to the targeted survivor communities. The command center's communication equipment was more sophisticated than anything I'd used before, with the capability to reach multiple locations simultaneously and coordinate complex tactical communications. However, using their equipment also meant that they would be able to monitor and potentially intercept my transmissions. Every warning I sent would provide them with additional intelligence about survivor locations, capabilities, and defensive preparations. I was faced with the choice of remaining silent to protect operational security or risking compromise of survivor positions in order to provide crucial tactical warnings. I decided to transmit the warnings using coded language-based on refinery emergency procedures that most of the infected wouldn't understand, but that survivors with technical backgrounds would recognize. This approach would minimize the intelligence value of intercepted transmissions while still conveying essential information about the timing and scope of the planned attacks. The first transmission went to Lieutenant Chen's National Guard installation, warning them about the accelerated timeline and the estimated size of the assault force they would be facing. I emphasized that this wasn't a typical infected attack, but a coordinated military-style operation involving specialized equipment and tactics that would require different defensive strategies. I explained that the infected had detailed intelligence about conventional military procedures and had developed specific countermeasures for standard defensive tactics. The National Guard units would need to implement unconventional strategies that exploited the infected's overconfidence in their intelligence gathering and tactical planning capabilities. The second transmission was a general broadcast to all survivor communities in the region, providing tactical intelligence about infected capabilities and organizational structure that could help them prepare more effective defenses. I included information about alpha leadership, specialized weapons, and psychological warfare techniques that most survivor groups hadn't encountered yet. I warned them about the infected's use of captured human voices for deception operations, their systematic approach to siege warfare, and their preference for eliminating medical and technical personnel as high-priority targets. Most importantly, I emphasized that they needed to prepare for coordinated attacks involving hundreds of infected individuals rather than the small groups they had been dealing with previously. The third and most important transmission was directed toward Elena's medical facility in Atlanta. I had no way of knowing if she was still alive or if the facility was still operational, but I had to try to warn them about the specific threats they would be facing. Medical facilities were high-priority targets because the infected understood that medical research represented the greatest long-term threat to their expansion. While I was transmitting these warnings, I monitored infected radio communications and discovered something that changed my understanding of their immediate objectives. The convergence operation wasn't just designed to eliminate survivor communities. It was the first phase of a much larger expansion plan that involved establishing permanent control over major metropolitan areas and transportation networks. They were planning to transform the convergence operation into a permanent occupation of strategic locations that would give them control over resources, manufacturing capabilities, and geographic positions needed for continental expansion. This wasn't just about hunting individual survivors anymore. This was about establishing a new form of civilization based on systematic predation and territorial control. The infected had learned that small-scale hunting operations weren't efficient enough to eliminate human resistance before survivors could organize effective countermeasures. Instead, they were implementing large-scale territorial conquest strategies that would allow them to control entire regions and eliminate human populations through systematic operations rather than individual attacks. I also discovered that they had been monitoring military communications and had detailed intelligence about National Guard capabilities, equipment, and tactical doctrines. They understood enough about conventional military operations to develop specific countermeasures for standard defensive strategies. The convergence operation was designed to exploit weaknesses in conventional military thinking that hadn't adapted to their unique capabilities. During my intelligence gathering, I found references to what they called Phase 2, operations that would begin immediately after the convergence operation was completed. Phase 2 involved establishing manufacturing facilities for mass production of specialized weapons and equipment, creating training centers for transforming captured humans into specialized roles, and implementing systematic resource extraction operations to support continental expansion. They had detailed plans for converting existing industrial infrastructure to support their operations, including chemical plants, manufacturing facilities, and transportation networks. My own refinery experience had been identified as particularly valuable for these Phase 2 operations, which explained why they were so determined to capture me alive rather than eliminate me as a threat. The scope of their planning was far beyond anything I'd imagined when I first encountered Mrs. Chen in her front yard, just 12 days earlier. They weren't just predators who had learned to cooperate. They were building a complete alternative, civilization designed to systematically replace human society through coordinated expansion and technological development. As I was completing my intelligence gathering and preparing to attempt an escape from the surrounded building, I heard radio communications that indicated they were beginning the convergence operation immediately, rather than waiting for their planned timeline. Something had triggered them to begin the coordinated attacks while their response team was still containing me at the command center. I realized that my own activities had forced them to accelerate their operations because they understood that coordinated survivor resistance was becoming more effective. The warnings I'd transmitted and the coordination efforts I'd helped establish were making it more difficult for them to achieve tactical surprise and overwhelming force advantages. This meant that survivor communities were about to face coordinated attacks before they'd had time to implement the defensive preparations I'd recommended. The tactical warnings I'd transmitted might not be enough to prevent catastrophic losses. Among the remaining human resistance groups in the region, I made the decision to abandon any attempt at personal escape in favor of using the command center's communication equipment to provide real-time tactical support to survivor communities during the attacks. This would certainly result in my capture or death, but it might make the difference between survival and elimination for hundreds of other people. Using their sophisticated communication network, I was able to monitor the progress of multiple simultaneous attacks and provide tactical updates to defender groups who were struggling to understand the coordinated nature of the assault they were facing. Most of the survivor communities were still thinking in terms of individual or small group threats rather than military-style operations involving hundreds of coordinated attackers. The first attack began at Lieutenant Chen's National Guard installation, and the tactical sophistication of the infected assault was immediately apparent. They weren't conducting frontal attacks against fortified positions. Instead, they were implementing complex multi-phase operations designed to systematically degrade defensive capabilities before attempting to breach perimeter security. The infected began with psychological warfare operations, using captured human voices to broadcast surrender demands and false tactical information, designed to create confusion and demoralization among the defenders. They followed this with coordinated attacks on communication equipment and power systems to disrupt command and control capabilities. Only after they had weakened defensive coordination did they begin direct assault operations, and even these were carefully planned to exploit specific vulnerabilities in conventional military defensive doctrines. They understood that National Guard units were trained for conventional threats rather than intelligent predators, with enhanced physical capabilities and coordinated tactical planning. Lieutenant Chen's radio reports indicated that the installation's defenders were adapting to the unconventional threat more quickly than the infected had anticipated, possibly because of the tactical warnings I'd provided earlier. However, the scale of the assault force was larger than military intelligence had estimated, and the defenders were rapidly consuming ammunition and other resources needed for sustained resistance. The second major attack was directed against a civilian survivor community that had established a defensive position in a shopping center complex. This attack demonstrated the infected's ability to adapt their tactics for different types of targets and defensive configurations. Against the civilian community, they implemented siege warfare techniques designed to cut off supply lines and gradually weaken resistance through attrition rather than direct assault. They understood that civilian defenders had limited military training and equipment, so they could afford to use patient tactics that would minimize their own losses while guaranteeing eventual success. The infected had also learned to exploit civilian emotional and social vulnerabilities that wouldn't be as effective against military units. They used captured community members to broadcast appeals for surrender, created false rescue scenarios to lure defenders out of protected positions, and implemented psychological pressure tactics designed to break down group cohesion and leadership. The third attack that I was able to monitor was directed against Elena's medical facility in Atlanta, and this operation revealed the infected's understanding of the strategic importance of medical research and personnel. They weren't trying to capture the facility intact. Instead, they were implementing systematic destruction of medical equipment, research materials, and personnel that could contribute to treatment or vaccine development. This attack was the most ruthless and efficient of the three operations I observed. The infected understood that eliminating medical capabilities was crucial to preventing long-term human resistance, so they were willing to accept higher losses in order to ensure complete destruction of research and treatment capabilities. However, Elena's facility had implemented some of the defensive measures I'd recommended during our radio communications, and they were putting up more effective resistance than the infected had anticipated. Medical personnel had proven to be surprisingly adaptable to tactical situations, possibly because of their experience with emergency procedures and crisis management. While I was providing tactical support to these defensive operations, I realized that the infected response team surrounding my building was preparing to begin their extraction operation. I could hear them moving through the lower floors and establishing positions that would allow them to systematically clear the building while minimizing damage to valuable equipment and information. More importantly, I detected alpha-infected individuals in their assault team who would be capable of conducting sophisticated interrogation and intelligence extraction procedures once they captured me. My knowledge of refinery operations, chemical processes, and survivor coordination efforts would provide them with significant tactical advantages for future operations. I made the decision to destroy the command center's intelligence files and communication equipment rather than allow them to fall into infected hands. The information I'd gathered about their organizational structure and expansion plans needed to be preserved, but the detailed files about individual survivors and community capabilities were too dangerous to leave intact. Using my knowledge of chemical processes and industrial systems, I prepared incendiary devices that would destroy electronic equipment and paper files while creating enough smoke and confusion to potentially mask an escape attempt. The chemical reactions would also produce toxic compounds that might be harmful to infected individuals, despite their enhanced physical capabilities. As I was preparing the destruction of the command center, I received a radio transmission that changed everything. Elena's voice came through clearly, reporting that her medical facility had successfully repelled the infected attack and that they had captured several infected individuals for research purposes. More importantly, they had made a breakthrough in understanding the biological mechanisms of the transformation process. Elena explained that the infection wasn't irreversible in all cases. Early-stage infections could potentially be treated using a combination of antiviral medications and targeted electromagnetic therapy that could disrupt the neurological changes before they became permanent. They had successfully treated 3 individuals who had been in the initial stages of transformation. This meant that the infected's expansion wasn't inevitable. Medical science could potentially develop effective treatments and even preventive measures that would stop the systematic transformation of human populations. The infected had been right to prioritize the elimination of medical research capabilities because medical science represented a genuine existential threat to their expansion plans. However, Elena also warned that the infected were already adapting to the medical countermeasures. They had captured infected individuals who were demonstrating resistance to early treatment attempts, suggesting that the transformation process was evolving in response to medical intervention. The window of opportunity for developing effective treatments might be limited. Elena's transmission was interrupted by sounds of renewed combat, but before communication was lost, she provided coordinates for a supply cache where she had hidden copies of the medical research data. This information needed to reach other medical facilities and research centers before the infected could implement countermeasures that would make treatment development impossible. I realized that getting this medical intelligence to other survivor communities was more important than any other objective, including my own survival. The coordinates Elena had provided were only about 20 miles from my current location, but reaching them would require escaping from the infected response team and crossing territory that was now under active assault from convergence operation forces. The incendiary devices I'd prepared were ready to deploy, and I could hear the infected assault team beginning their systematic clearance of the building. They were moving methodically through each floor, checking every room and establishing secure areas as they advanced. Their patience and thoroughness suggested that they were confident about the eventual success of their extraction operation. I activated the chemical destruction devices and began my escape attempt using emergency exits and structural features that the infected might not have anticipated in their tactical planning. The industrial chemicals created thick, toxic smoke that filled the upper floors and would hopefully interfere with their enhanced sensory capabilities. The escape was successful, but only because the infected assault team had been focused on capturing me alive, rather than preventing my escape at all costs. Their tactical restraint created opportunities that wouldn't have existed if they had been willing to accept my death as an acceptable outcome. However, I knew that escaping from the building was only the beginning of a much more difficult challenge. The infected now understood that I had access to crucial intelligence about medical research breakthroughs, and they would be directing significant resources toward recapturing me before I could transmit this information to other survivor communities. The convergence operation was continuing across the region, and radio communications indicated mixed results for the various attacks. Some survivor communities were successfully implementing the defensive measures I'd recommended, while others were being overwhelmed by the scale and coordination of the infected assault forces. What had become clear was that this was the pivotal moment in the conflict between human survivors and the infected civilization. The success or failure of the convergence operation would determine whether humans could maintain organized resistance or would be reduced to scattered individuals trying to survive in a world controlled by intelligent predators. The journey toward Elena's supply cache would take me directly through the convergence operation battlefield, where the largest coordinated infected assault in the region was taking place. I could hear the sounds of combat getting closer as I moved toward Highway 90, and radio communications indicated that multiple survivor positions were under simultaneous attack. That's when I made the decision that brought me to Murphy's gas station. The facility offered everything I needed for the confrontation I knew was coming. Concrete walls that could withstand significant damage, limited access points that could be defended by a single person, clear fields of observation for monitoring approaching threats, and most importantly, a sophisticated CB radio setup that the previous owner had installed for long-distance communication. I spent the next several hours fortifying the gas station using principles I'd learned from Refinery emergency response procedures. The key was creating multiple defensive layers that would force attackers to expose themselves while providing me with covered positions and escape routes. I used industrial chemicals from my supply cache to create defensive barriers and potential weapons that could be deployed when the situation became critical. The CB radio equipment allowed me to establish contact with survivor groups across a much wider area than I'd been able to reach before. I coordinated with Lieutenant Chen's National Guard installation, several civilian communities that were implementing defensive measures, and most importantly, with Elena's medical facility. In Atlanta, Elena confirmed that her team had successfully defended their position and were continuing their medical research using the infected individuals they had captured during the attack. The treatment protocols they had developed were showing promising results, but they needed more time and resources to refine the procedures and develop methods for large-scale implementation. More critically, Elena provided information about a coordinated network of medical facilities and research centers that were sharing data and working together to develop comprehensive treatment and prevention strategies. If the medical research could be protected and distributed, it might be possible to turn the tide of the infection within weeks rather than months. During my 12th day at the gas station, I detected radio communications indicating that a massive infected force was moving toward my location. The convergence operation had evolved into something even larger than I'd anticipated, with infected groups from across multiple states converging on strategic positions throughout the region. I realized that Murphy's gas station had been identified as a crucial communication hub for survivor coordination efforts, and the infected were planning to eliminate it as part of their systematic campaign to disrupt human resistance networks. The attack force moving toward my position was larger than anything I'd faced before, including multiple alpha individuals and specialized equipment. The night before the attack, I made contact with survivor groups across the entire region and coordinated a simultaneous defensive operation that would support multiple communities under assault. Using my Refinery crisis management experience, I established communication protocols and tactical coordination procedures that allowed isolated groups to function as a unified resistance network. Lieutenant Chen's National Guard unit provided tactical support and coordination for military aspects of the defense, while civilian communities contributed intelligence about infected movements and resource sharing for extended resistance operations. Elena's medical facility shared real-time updates about treatment development and provided medical support for wounded defenders. On my 13th day, the coordinated infected assault began at dawn. The attack was unlike anything I'd witnessed during the previous weeks. Hundreds of infected individuals approached the gas station using sophisticated tactical formations that demonstrated military-level planning and coordination. The assault came in multiple waves, each one designed to test different aspects of my defensive preparations and gather intelligence about my capabilities and resources. The infected were treating this attack as both a tactical operation and a learning experience that would inform their future assault strategies. The first wave consisted of standard infected individuals who probed my perimeter defenses and tested my response capabilities. I used chemical barriers and diversions to channel their approach into predetermined kill zones, while conserving ammunition and more sophisticated defensive measures for later waves. The second wave included alpha individuals who coordinated more complex tactical maneuvers designed to exploit weaknesses they had identified during the first assault. These alphas demonstrated the same tactical intelligence I'd encountered during my previous direct contacts, using systematic approaches to gradually degrade my defensive capabilities. The third wave was the most dangerous, consisting of infected individuals equipped with specialized weapons and equipment that had been developed specifically for assaulting fortified positions. They understood enough about defensive engineering to target structural weak points in critical systems that could compromise the entire defensive position. Throughout the assault, I maintained radio contact with the Coordinated Survivor Network, providing real-time tactical intelligence about infected capabilities while receiving support and coordination from other defensive positions under simultaneous attack. The regional defense network was functioning exactly as I'd hoped, allowing isolated communities to support each other despite being separated by significant distances. During the height of the assault, I had my most significant encounter with an alpha-infected individual since my escape from the command center. This alpha approached the gas station under a flag of truce, requesting direct negotiation about terms for surrender and cooperation. The alpha was a man in his 40s who had obviously been a professional military officer before his transformation. He spoke clearly and demonstrated tactical knowledge that was immediately recognizable as advanced military training. His approach to negotiation was professional and sophisticated, offering terms that were designed to appeal to logical survival considerations. He explained that the infected were prepared to offer me a position within their organizational structure that would utilize my technical knowledge while providing protection and resources that isolated human resistance couldn't match. The offer included access to advanced facilities, coordination with other technical specialists who had joined their organization, and participation in Phase 2 operations that would rebuild technological civilization under infected control. What made the encounter particularly disturbing was that his arguments were logically compelling from a pure survival perspective. The infected organization offered resources, security, and technological advancement that scattered human resistance groups couldn't provide. From a rational standpoint, cooperation might be the optimal strategy for long-term survival. However, the Alpha also made it clear that refusal to cooperate would result in elimination, not just of my position, but of the entire survivor coordination network that I had helped establish. They had identified the communication hub at Murphy's gas station as critical infrastructure for human resistance, and they were prepared to commit whatever resources were necessary to eliminate it. I declined the offer and prepared for the final assault phase. But the negotiation had provided crucial intelligence about infected strategic thinking and long-term objectives. They understood that systematic elimination of resistance leadership and coordination capabilities was more important than simply hunting individual survivors. The final assault began immediately after the negotiation ended, and it was clear that the infected were committing their most sophisticated resources to ensure success. The attack included coordinated strikes on my communication equipment, systematic degradation of structural defenses, and precise targeting of critical systems that could compromise my ability to continue resistance. However, the defensive preparations I'd made using my Refinery emergency response experience proved more effective than the infected had anticipated. Industrial chemicals created barriers and diversions that disrupted their tactical coordination, while the fortified positions I'd established provided protection against their specialized weapons and equipment. Most importantly, the survivor coordination network continued to function throughout the assault, allowing other communities to provide tactical support and intelligence that helped me anticipate and counter infected tactical adjustments. The regional defense network had evolved into something more sophisticated than individual community defense, creating a distributed resistance capability that was harder to eliminate through localized attacks. By the end of my 13th day, the infected assault had been repelled, but both sides had learned crucial information about each other's capabilities and limitations. The infected now understood that human resistance had evolved beyond isolated survival groups into coordinated networks that could provide mutual support across significant distances. I had learned that the infected were capable of committing enormous resources to eliminate strategic targets, but that their tactical approaches were predictable enough to be countered by defenders who understood their organizational methods and strategic objectives. On my 14th day, I received confirmation that the convergence operation had failed to achieve its primary objectives. Multiple survivor communities had successfully defended their positions, the medical research network had continued to function and make progress on treatment development, and the coordination capabilities that threatened infected expansion had not been eliminated. Elena made contact to report that her medical team had achieved a major breakthrough in treatment effectiveness and were preparing to distribute the new protocols to medical facilities across the survivor network. The infected's window of opportunity for preventing effective treatment development was closing rapidly. Lieutenant Chen confirmed that National Guard installations were coordinating with civilian communities to establish more sophisticated defensive networks that could counter future infected offensive operations. The military was adapting its tactics and strategies to deal with the unique threat characteristics that conventional training hadn't addressed. Most importantly, I had established contact with survivor groups that included other technical specialists with industrial and engineering backgrounds. We were beginning to coordinate efforts to restore manufacturing capabilities and develop technological resources that could support long-term resistance and eventual recovery operations. The infected were regrouping for what appeared to be an even larger offensive operation. But human resistance had evolved rapidly during the convergence operation and was no longer the scattered, uncoordinated survivor groups that had been vulnerable to systematic elimination. I'm still here at Murphy's gas station, coordinating resistance activities and preparing for the next phase of this conflict. What I learned during these first 14 days has given us the foundation for building effective countermeasures against infected expansion, but I can already see that they're adapting their strategies in response to our success. The radio equipment here has become crucial for maintaining coordination between survivor communities, and I'm using my refinery expertise to help other groups develop the industrial capabilities we'll need for long-term resistance. Elena's medical research is providing hope that we can actually reverse some of the damage that's been done, and the coordination network we've established is growing stronger every day. What I'm about to tell you next might sound crazy, but I think I've figured out how to use industrial chemical processes to create weapons and defensive systems that can level the playing field against their enhanced capabilities. It all goes back to what I learned at the refinery about controlling chemical reactions and using them to achieve specific results under dangerous conditions.